Growing up as the youngest in the Morrison family meant I was always treated like the family afterthought. While my brother Jake got praised for every minor achievement, I was consistently dismissed as the quiet one who would never amount to much. My parents had a way of making me feel invisible, especially when it came to anything important. The pattern started early. When Jake graduated high school with C's, they threw him a party. When I graduated valedictorian 3 years later, they said congratulations and moved on to discussing Jake's latest job prospects. When Jake got his first apartment, they helped him move and bought him furniture. When I bought my first house at 25, they said it was probably too much responsibility for someone my age. That house became my sanctuary. It was a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing flashy, but it was mine. I'd saved every penny from my government job, working extra shifts and living frugally to make the down payment. The day I got the keys, I called to share the news with my family. "You bought a house?" Mom had sounded skeptical. "Are you sure you can afford the payments?" "It's a good investment," I'd replied, trying to keep the excitement in my voice. "Investment?" Jake had laughed in the background. "She can barely afford car insurance. This is going to end badly." Dad had taken the phone. "Honey, maybe you should have talked to us first. Houses are a big responsibility. What if something breaks? What if you lose your job?" I'd hung up, feeling deflated. Even my biggest achievement was treated like a mistake waiting to happen. Over the next few years, the house became a source of ongoing family commentary. Every family gathering included some reference to my expensive mistake or questions about whether I was keeping up with the payments. Jake particularly enjoyed making jokes about my mortgage chains and how I was tied down to a depreciating asset. "Smart people rent," he'd announce at family dinners. "Flexibility is everything." Sarah stuck with that house whether she likes it or not. The comments stung, but I'd learned not to react. I just smile and changed the subject. Meanwhile, Jake bounced between jobs and apartments, always asking our parents for money to cover rent or security deposits. But somehow his financial instability was seen as exploring options, while my stable home ownership was viewed as limiting myself. The real problem started last summer when I accepted a temporary assignment overseas. The government position required me to spend 6 months in Eastern Europe working on what I could only describe to my family as administrative oversight. The details were classified, but the work was important and the pay was excellent. Before leaving, I made all the arrangements for my house. I set up automatic payments for utilities, arranged for lawn care, and installed a comprehensive security system. I also gave my parents emergency contact information and a spare key purely for genuine emergencies like burst pipes or break-ins, just in case something catastrophic happens, I'd explain during the handover. Otherwise, the house should take care of itself. Jake had rolled his eyes. "Look at her preparing for her little house like it's a historic landmark. It's just a basic suburban house, Sarah." "A basic house she can't really afford," Mom had added with a sigh. I'd bitten my tongue and finished the security briefing. Before boarding my flight, I'd reminded them one more time that the key was only for emergencies. The work overseas was intense and consuming. I was deep in financial investigations that required my complete attention, tracking complex networks that crossed multiple countries. The days were long and communication with home was limited due to security protocols. I'd managed to check in with my family a few times, brief conversations where everyone assured me everything was fine. "House is still standing," Jake had joked during one call. "No disasters yet." I'd relaxed, focusing on my work. The investigation was reaching a critical phase, and I was coordinating with international law enforcement on several high-priority cases. My expertise in financial crimes had made me an essential part of the team, and the work was some of the most important of my career. The assignment was supposed to end in March, but complications arose that required my expertise for an additional month. I'd sent a message to my family explaining the extension, and everyone seemed fine with the news. "Take all the time you need," Dad had written back. "We're managing everything here." What I didn't know was that Jake had been watching my house for months, noticing that I never returned, never visited, never seemed to check on the property. In his mind, This confirmed what he'd always believed. I was in over my head, probably struggling financially and too proud to admit I needed help. The first sign of trouble came through my secure communication channel. My supervisor pulled me aside during what was supposed to be my final week overseas. "We've got an unusual situation," Agent Martinez had said, holding a classified report. "There's been some activity at your registered address. Nothing threatening, but it's flagged in our monitoring systems." My blood ran cold. What kind of activity? Property transaction? Someone filed paperwork claiming ownership transfer. It's probably nothing, but given your security clearance and current assignment, we need to investigate any irregularities. I'd stared at the report, not understanding. That's impossible. I own that house. There's no transaction. That's why it's flagged as suspicious. Real estate fraud is sometimes used to compromise federal employees. We're treating this as a potential security threat until we know more. The flight home was a nightmare. I couldn't contact my family due to operational security, and I couldn't get details about what had happened to my house. All I knew was that somehow someone had filed paperwork claiming they'd purchased my property and federal investigators were now involved. I landed on a Tuesday morning and drove straight home. The house looked normal from the outside, but there was a lockbox on the front door and a sold sign on the lawn. My key didn't work. My hands shaking, I called the number on the real estate sign, Morrison Property Services. A cheerful voice answered. "This is Sarah Morrison. Someone put a sold sign on my house and I need to know what's happening." There was a pause. "Oh, you must be the sister. Jake told us you might call. He explained that you'd been struggling with the payments and finally agreed to let him handle the sale." "Congratulations on getting out from under that mortgage." My stomach dropped. "Jake Morrison is my brother and he doesn't own this house." "I do, ma'am. I have all the paperwork right here." Jake Morrison presented power of attorney documents and a deed showing his ownership. "He said you'd been overseas and unable to handle the transaction yourself. The sale closed last week." I hung up and immediately called my parents' house. Sarah. Mom sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. "You're back. How was your trip? Where's Jake? I need to talk to him right now." "He's here. We're actually having a little celebration dinner. Jake made such a smart business decision, and we're so proud of him. Put him on the phone now." Jake's voice came through cocky and amused. "Hey sis, welcome back to reality. What did you do to my house? I solved your problem. You were clearly in over your head, gone for months, probably behind on payments. I found a buyer, handled the paperwork, and got you out of that financial mess. You should be thanking me. That wasn't your house to sell." "Sarah, honey." Dad's voice cut in on speakerphone. "Jake showed us all the financial documents. You were 3 months behind on payments. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. Jake saved your credit rating. I felt like I was losing my mind. That's impossible. All my payments are automatic. I haven't missed a single payment in 3 years. The bank records don't lie," Jake said smugly. "Look, I know this is embarrassing, but I handled it quietly. The buyer was willing to take over the debt and pay you a small amount to walk away. You actually made $15,000 after all the fees. Where's my $15,000? I deposited it in your account minus the money you owed me for handling everything. But that's not the point. The point is you're free now. No more house payments you couldn't afford." I was hyperventilating. "Jake, I need you to listen very carefully. I never missed a payment. I never gave you permission to sell my house, and I never signed any power of attorney. Sarah, we have your signature on all the documents." Mom interjected gently. "Maybe the stress of that job overseas affected your memory." That's when I realized what had happened. Jake had forged my signature, probably using documents he'd seen over the years. He'd somehow convinced a real estate agent and a title company that he had the right to sell my house. And my family believed his story about missed payments. But what Jake didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my house wasn't just any property. Due to my security clearance and the sensitive nature of my work, I'd been required to register my address with federal authorities. My property was monitored as part of national security protocols, and any unauthorized transactions would trigger immediate investigation. "I need to come over," I said quietly. "We need to discuss this in person." "Of course," Dad said warmly. "Come celebrate with us. Jake's already talking about investing your portion in his new business venture." I drove to my childhood home in a daze. The familiar living room was decorated like a party with a "Congratulations, Jake" banner hanging over the fireplace. My brother was holding court in Dad's recliner, telling the story of how he'd rescued me from financial disaster. "And the best part," Jake was saying as I walked in, "is that she doesn't have to worry about property taxes or maintenance anymore. I basically gave her back her freedom." There she is. Mom hugged me tightly. "We're so proud of Jake for looking out for you." I looked around the room at my family's happy faces. They genuinely believed Jake had done something wonderful. In their minds, I was the irresponsible younger sister who'd gotten in over her head, and Jake was the hero who'd cleaned up my mess. "Tell me exactly what happened," I said, sitting down across from Jake. "It's pretty simple," Jake began, clearly enjoying the attention. "I noticed you never came back to check on the house. Neighbors mentioned they hadn't seen you in months. I drove by and saw the lawn was getting overgrown despite the service. Mail was piling up despite forwarding, and the place looked abandoned. So I did some digging," he continued proudly. "Called the mortgage company, pretending to be worried about my sister. They confirmed you were behind on payments." 3 months, Sarah. 3 full months. This was impossible. I knew my automatic payments were working. I checked my accounts regularly, even from overseas. So I went to the bank," Jake continued. "Explained the situation. They said foreclosure proceedings had started and the property would go to auction within 60 days. That's when I knew I had to step in." "How did you get the legal right to sell?" I asked carefully. Jake pulled out a folder of documents. "Power of attorney. Lucky thing you signed this before you left for your mysterious job." He handed me a document with my signature at the bottom. The signature looked perfect, too perfect. Jake had always been good at forgery, a skill he'd used in high school to sign his own report cards. "I don't remember signing this," I said quietly. "You signed it the day before you left," Jake said confidently. "You said it was in case of emergencies. Don't you remember? You were really stressed about leaving the house." The room full of family members nodded sympathetically. In their version of events, I'd been overwhelmed and Jake had stepped up to help. "The buyer was great," Jake continued. "A nice young couple, first-time homeowners. They were pre-approved for the full amount and willing to close quickly. Honestly, Sarah, you should see how happy they are. They're planning to start a family in your old house, and you handled all the paperwork." So I asked everything. Title transfer, mortgage payoff, even coordinated with the real estate agent. I saved you thousands in commission by finding the buyers myself. Jake was beaming with pride. "Sold your little house for $300,000, he announced dramatically, clearly having practiced this moment. The family burst into applause. "Finally making smart decisions," Mom cheered. I said nothing and smiled, my mind racing. Jake had no idea what he'd actually done. He thought he'd sold a simple suburban house, but he'd actually illegally transferred federal property under active security monitoring. My phone buzzed with a secure message. "Agent Martinez, need immediate debrief. Federal crime reported at your address." "Are you secure?" I typed back. "Secure family gathering. We'll call within an hour." "Everything okay?" Dad asked, noticing my phone. "Just work," I said calmly. "Jake, can you tell me the buyers' names? I want to send them a welcome card. David and Michelle Parker." Sweet couple, probably mid-20s. They're so excited about their first house. Jake was clearly proud of his matchmaking. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. "Hello, is this Sarah Morrison?" The voice was panicked, almost screaming. "Yes, who is this?" "This is James Wheeler from Wheeler and Associates Law Firm. We represented the Parker family in the purchase of your property." I walked into the kitchen for privacy. "What can I help you with, Mr. Wheeler? Why are FBI agents at our office?" He shouted into the phone. "They have a warrant for all documents related to the Morrison property sale. They're saying the transaction was fraudulent and potentially involves national security violations. I could hear the family in the living room still laughing and celebrating Jake's business success. "Mr. Wheeler, I need you to listen carefully," I said quietly. "I never authorized the sale of my house. My brother forged my signature and illegally transferred federal property." "What?" "But he had power of attorney documents. He had your signature. Those documents are forged. The signature is fake. And Mr. Wheeler, my property is registered with federal authorities due to my security clearance. Any unauthorized transaction triggers an automatic investigation." There was silence on the other end. Then the sound of papers rustling frantically. "Oh God," Wheeler whispered. "The FBI agents are asking about wire fraud, identity theft, and something about federal property protection statutes. They want to know if we verified the power of attorney documents. Did you? We accepted them in good faith." "Your brother seemed legitimate, and the signature looked authentic." I could hear shouting in the background of Wheeler's office. "Mr. Wheeler, I need to ask you something important. Are the Parker family in your office right now?" "Yes." "They're here trying to understand why federal agents are confiscating all their closing documents. Tell them I'm very sorry, but they were victims of fraud. The sale was illegal and they need to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, but they spent their life savings. They took out a mortgage. They've already moved in. The FBI will handle the financial recovery process. Right now, everyone needs to focus on cooperating with federal investigators." I hung up and walked back to the living room where Jake was still holding court. "Who was that?" Mom asked. "The buyer's lawyer," I said calmly. Jake perked up with interest. "Everything okay? No problems with the closing, I hope." I sat down and looked at my brother. "Jake, I need you to understand something very important. My house wasn't just any property. Due to my job and security clearance, it's registered with federal authorities. Any unauthorized transaction triggers automatic investigation." Jake laughed. "Come on, Sarah. It's just a regular house in a regular neighborhood. Don't be so dramatic. The FBI is currently confiscating all documents related to the sale," I said quietly. "They're treating this as wire fraud, identity theft, and illegal transfer of federal property." The room went silent. "That's ridiculous," Dad said after a moment. "Jake was helping you out of a bad situation. There was no bad situation. I never missed a payment. I never signed a power of attorney, and I never gave anyone permission to sell my house." Jake's confidence was starting to crack, but the bank confirmed you were behind on payments. "Jake, did you actually speak to my mortgage company, or did you call a different number?" His face went pale. "I called the number I found online." "What name did you give them?" "I said I was Jake Morrison, your brother, and I was concerned about your property." I nodded slowly, and they gave you detailed financial information about my mortgage over the phone, based on nothing more than sharing my last name. The room was getting uncomfortable. Family members were starting to look confused. "The signature on the power of attorney," I continued. "Can you tell me when and where I supposedly signed it?" "The day before you left. In your kitchen." "Jake, I left from the airport directly from my office. I never went home that day, and I certainly never signed any legal documents giving you control of my property." My phone started ringing. "Agent Martinez." "Excuse me," I said, stepping onto the back porch. "This is Sarah Morrison." "Agent Morrison, we need you to come in immediately. We've got a federal crime scene at your property address, and we need your full debrief on the security implications. My brother is here with my family. He believes he was helping me by selling the house." "Your brother committed wire fraud, identity theft, and illegal transfer of federal property. The buyers are victims. The real estate professionals are potential accomplices, and your family property is now evidence in a federal investigation. What happens next? We're executing arrest warrants within the hour. Your brother needs to be taken into custody before he has a chance to destroy evidence or flee. Can you keep him at your current location? He doesn't know he's committed a crime. He thinks he was helping me. Agent Morrison, your brother forged federal documents and illegally transferred government-monitored property. His intentions are irrelevant to the charges." I hung up and walked back inside. The mood in the living room had shifted. Jake was frantically looking through his folder of documents, and my parents were asking questions he couldn't answer. "Sarah," Mom said when I sat down, "Jake says the mortgage company told him you were behind on payments, but he can't remember exactly who he spoke to or when. And the power of attorney," Dad added. "Jake says you signed it in your kitchen, but you said you left from your office." Jake was sweating now. "Look, maybe I'm remembering some details wrong, but the important thing is, I helped Sarah get out of a bad situation." "What bad situation?" I asked gently. "My mortgage payments were automatic and current. I never asked for help. And I certainly never signed any documents giving you legal control of my property." "But the foreclosure notices," Jake started, then stopped. "What foreclosure notices? I saw them in your mailbox, Jake. I had mail forwarding set up before I left. All my mail was being sent to a secure federal facility. There was no mail in my mailbox." The room was silent except for the sound of Jake's papers rustling as he frantically searched through the documents. "Maybe there was some confusion," Mom said hopefully. "Maybe Jake misunderstood the situation but was trying to help." "The problem," I said carefully, "is that Jake forged my signature on legal documents and illegally sold federal property. Even if his intentions were good, those are serious federal crimes." Jake stood up suddenly. "This is insane. It's just a house, a regular house in suburbia. There's nothing federal about it. My security clearance requires registration of my primary residence with federal authorities," I explained. "Any unauthorized transaction triggers automatic investigation." "Security clearance for what?" Dad asked. "You said you worked in administrative oversight." I looked around the room at my family's confused faces. "I work in financial crimes investigation, international money laundering, terrorism funding, organized crime networks. My property is monitored as part of national security protocols." Jake sat down hard. "You're serious?" "The buyer's lawyer just called because FBI agents are confiscating all closing documents. The buyer spent their life savings on a house they can't legally own because the sale was fraudulent." "But I have power of attorney," Jake said weakly. "You forged power of attorney." "The signature is fake." "Jake, we both know you've always been good at copying signatures." My phone buzzed with another secure message. "Federal agents en route 10 minutes. I looked at Jake, who was starting to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. "Jake, federal agents are going to be here very soon. They're going to arrest you for wire fraud, identity theft, and illegal transfer of federal property. You need to cooperate fully and get a lawyer immediately." "Arrest." Mom gasped, but he was trying to help. "Mom, Jake forged my signature and illegally sold my house. The fact that he thought he was helping doesn't change the crimes he committed." Jake was staring at the documents in his folder, probably seeing them clearly for the first time: the forged power of attorney, the fake mortgage default notices he'd created to justify his actions, the identity theft he'd committed by impersonating me to the buyers. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered. "I know," I said gently, "but it did happen. You stole a $300,000 asset and sold it without permission. That's a federal crime regardless of your intentions." Car doors slammed outside. Through the front window, I could see unmarked black SUVs pulling into the driveway. "Sarah Morrison." A voice called from the front door. "In here," I called back. 4 FBI agents entered the living room, badges displayed. Agent Martinez nodded at me professionally. "Agent Morrison," he said formally. "Is this the subject?" I looked at Jake, who had gone completely pale. "This is my brother, Jake Morrison. He's the one who forged the documents and executed the illegal property transfer." Jake Morrison, Agent Martinez, announced, "You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and illegal transfer of federal property." The handcuffs clicked shut around Jake's wrists as the agents read him his rights. My parents were crying, asking if this was really necessary. Couldn't there be some misunderstanding? "Ma'am," Agent Martinez explained to my mother, "your son committed multiple federal felonies. He forged government documents and illegally transferred property under federal monitoring. This is a national security issue. As they led Jake to the car, he looked back at me with a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "I was trying to help you," he said. "I know," I replied, "but you committed serious crimes in the process." After the agents left with Jake, I sat with my parents in the suddenly quiet living room. The "Congratulations, Jake" banner looked absurd, hanging over the fireplace. "What happens now?" Dad asked. "Jake will be processed and charged. He'll need a good lawyer and will probably face several years in federal prison. The buyers will get their money back through the Federal Victim Recovery Program, but their dream of homeownership is ruined. The real estate professionals who facilitated the fraud will face investigation and potential charges. And you, I get my house back eventually after it's processed as evidence in a federal investigation." Mom was crying quietly. "How did this happen?" "Jake really thought he was helping you." Jake saw what he wanted to see. He convinced himself I was failing financially because that fit his image of me as the incompetent younger sister. Instead of asking questions or talking to me directly, he committed multiple felonies based on assumptions. Over the following weeks, the full scope of Jake's crimes became clear. He'd created fake mortgage default notices by copying letterheads from online images. He'd practiced my signature for months, perfecting it until even I had trouble telling the forgeries from authentic samples. He'd researched power of attorney laws and created documents that looked legitimate to anyone who didn't verify them carefully. The real estate agent and title company faced investigation for failing to properly verify the documentation. The buyers, David and Michelle Parker, were traumatized by the experience of having federal agents seize their dream home, but they cooperated fully with the investigation and eventually received full restitution. Jake was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. During the sentencing hearing, he finally acknowledged the scope of what he'd done. "I convinced myself Sarah was in trouble and I was helping her," he told the judge. "But the truth is, I never respected her success. I assumed she was failing because I couldn't accept that my younger sister was more successful than me. My crimes weren't about helping anyone. They were about maintaining my image as the responsible older brother." The hardest part wasn't Jake's imprisonment or the legal proceedings. It was the family conversations afterward when my parents slowly came to understand that their perception of me as the irresponsible child was completely wrong. I'd been successful, stable, and competent all along. They'd just been unable to see it because it didn't match their assumptions. "We failed you," Dad said during one difficult conversation. "We treated you like you were incapable when you were the most capable person in the family. You believed what Jake told you. I said he's very convincing when he wants to be, but we should have known better. We should have known you better." I moved back into my house 6 months later after it was released from evidence. The security systems had been upgraded and federal monitoring was now even more comprehensive. Jake's crime had actually resulted in enhanced protection for my property. The experience taught me something important about family dynamics and assumptions. My relatives had been so invested in seeing me as the family failure that they'd accepted an elaborate criminal conspiracy rather than questioning their beliefs about my competence. Jake served his full sentence and was released on parole. We've had limited contact since then. He's working as a warehouse employee and living in a supervised halfway house. The federal conviction destroyed his credit, his career prospects, and his reputation in our hometown. During his first supervised visit to my house after his release, he looked around the living room where federal agents had arrested him. "I really thought I was helping you," he said quietly. "I know you did. But Jake, you never once asked me if I needed help. You just assumed I was failing and took action based on that assumption. I couldn't believe my little sister was more successful than me. That was your problem to solve, not mine to accommodate." He nodded slowly. "I destroyed everything for both of us because I couldn't handle the truth about who you really were." The story became something of a legend in federal law enforcement circles. Agent Martinez still uses it in training seminars about property fraud and family crimes. The case file is titled "The Helpful Brother," And it's become a cautionary tale about how criminal behavior can be rationalized as assistance. But for me, it was a lesson about something deeper than crime and punishment. It was about the danger of family members who love you but refuse to see you clearly. Jake's crimes weren't really about the house or money. They were about his inability to accept that his assumptions about me were wrong. Sometimes the people who claim to know you best are the ones who refuse to acknowledge who you've actually become. And sometimes protecting yourself from that willful blindness requires consequences that feel disproportionate to the underlying emotional crime. Jake learned that lesson through federal prison. My parents learned it through the shock of watching their son get arrested in their living room, and I learned it through the strange experience of having my competence validated by FBI agents instead of my own family. The house still stands in the same quiet neighborhood. The buyers, David and Michelle Parker, eventually found another home and sent me a card thanking me for cooperating with the investigation that returned their down payment. The real estate agent lost her license. The title company implemented new verification procedures, and Jake learned that assumptions about family members can become criminal acts when those assumptions drive you to forge signatures and steal federal property. I still get Christmas cards from Agent Martinez. Last year's card read, "Hope your family dynamics are less exciting these days." They are, but it took federal intervention to make that possible.